the general problem of packages. Okay, so we just talked about the problem of pointing, self-pointing, pointing to itself or self-reference. And you actually get this problem of self-reference if you have a view of things being packaged by other things. Okay, so I'm going to just read this packaging assumption, and then I'm going to illustrate it a little bit, and then I'm going to show how it leads to a contradiction. So the packaging assumption, this is the general assumption, is that for any things that there are, any real things, whatever they are, whether they're numbers, people, particles, anything, whatever they are, call them the X's, there's some package of just them. For example, you might think there's a set of just them. So that the set would, in a way, be a package of those things. So if you have 10 marbles, in addition to the 10 marbles, there's also this set of those 10 marbles, right? So mathematicians like to talk about sets of things. And you might sort of want to say that like all things, whatever they are, have a set, but then there's famous problems with that. The problem actually we're talking about here. Another example of a package is going to be like a proposition. So, there's the proposition that those things exist, or you could have a thought about them, or, and this is relevant to omniscience, if there's knowledge of them. So for any things that exist, there's knowledge of those things, then that knowledge in a way is a way of packaging those things. So the knowledge of the marbles is in itself a marble. It's something else that packages the marbles. I'm using the term package in a very general way. I just mean anything that refers to those other things and sort of binds them together by reference. So that's the starting assumption. You might feel like initially that shouldn't be a problem, but that assumption leads straight to a contradiction through sort of a famous line of Russellian argumentation. So I'll just complete the argument then. Premise 2 is if premise 1, if that assumption is true, then there's going to be a package, call it P for paradox, of the things that aren't in their own package. So just to back up a little bit here, some packages will be in their own package if premise 1 is true, and some will not. So for example, consider the package of all things. That package is among the real things. And so therefore that package, the package of all things, is itself in its own package. So it's self-referenced. All right. But not all packages are going to be in themselves, like the package of all the blue things. That package is not itself blue. Okay. The package of all the marbles, that's not itself marble. So let P be the package of all the things that aren't in their own package. P exists according to the first premise. There is a package for all things, including all things not in their own package. But then this third premise is the contradiction, which is that if you think about it, P is going to be in its own package if and only if it isn't in its own package. And it takes a little bit of work to tease this out. The way that I do it is first I imagine, well, let's assume P is in its own package. What does that imply? Then let's assume that P is not in its own package. What does that imply? And we can show that in both ways, we get a contradiction. Would you like me to kind of draw that out a little bit, or?
Yeah, I would, because some of our listeners, aren't going to be professional philosophers. So I do want them to be able to see this contradiction, like to see it for themselves. Both you and I really appreciate that. Like, don't just take our word for this, right? See it with your own light of reason.
I love that, Joe, that you love that. This is my number one rule in my classes. I always tell them my number one rule for this class is don't believe me just because I tell you.
Exactly.
I invite you to see it for yourself. I think that really does make you very powerful if you can see it for yourself. So, so you can help clarify this, but I'm going to just sort of describe those two parts of the contradiction. So let's assume first that P, which is the package, and maybe for concreteness, let's just imagine the package is knowledge, because we're going to be talking about knowledge. So let's say it's God's knowledge of the things that aren't within that very package. So this won't be God's knowledge of everything, because obviously God's knowledge of everything is in itself, but this is the knowledge of all the things that are not in themselves. And so then let's imagine that this item of knowledge, P, is actually in itself. Let's imagine that that's the case. Well, if it's in itself, then by definition, it's actually the package of all the things that aren't in themselves. So by its own definition, it can't actually be in itself. So if it's in itself, then it's not in itself. So you get a contradiction that way. So then you think, well, then therefore you must say that it's not in itself. That must be what you say. But if you say it's not in itself, then the problem is that this very package P packages all of the things that aren't in itself. So if P is itself one of the things that's not in itself, then P, are you following me? P has to be one of the things it's packaging, because it's by definition packaging all the things that aren't in itself. So if we say it's not in itself, then it is one of the things that's packaging. But if it's one of the things it's packaging, that means it's packaging itself. So if it's not in itself, then it is in itself. And that's a contradiction in that direction. Okay, help me make that clear. I mean, I don't know. It's a very technical deduction. I don't know if you can say that in a clear way or in a better way.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, I think that was as clear as it's going to get. I mean, I can try, right? So saying things different ways can sometimes help people, right? So we have this package, right? Remember, for the audience, P is a package. It exists, and it is a package of all and only those things that aren't in their own package, okay? So that's what P is. There's a package P of the things that aren't in their own package. Now, either P is in its own package or it's not, okay? That's just either P or not. Like for some proposition Q, either Q or not Q, right? Law of excluded middle, essentially. Now, so P is either in itself, which by which I mean that it's in its own package, or it's not. Now, if it's in itself, well, remember, this package only contains things that aren't in themselves, right? It only contains things that aren't in their own package. And so if it's in itself, then it's not in itself. Okay.
Hey, Joe, here's our package. Just this is the visual aid, if people can see it. This is P. And we're imagining that it includes itself somehow. All right, keep going.
Yeah.
This will help people's minds.
Exactly. If it's in itself, well, then remember, because it only contains things that aren't in themselves, it follows that it's not in itself. So if it's in itself, then it's not in itself. So that's absurd. So we went down that horn, right? We suppose that it's in itself. But now let's go down the other horn, right? It's not in itself. Now, but if it's not in itself, remember, this package includes everything that's not in themselves, right? It includes all and only those things that aren't in themselves. And so if it's not in itself, it meets that condition, in which case it belongs in itself, right? And so if it's not in itself, then it is, in which case we get a contradiction. So either way, whether we suppose that it's in itself or we suppose that it's not in itself, we get a contradiction. And so contradiction ensues either way. That's why it's contradictory. Anyway, I hope that people are seeing this because it's fun, firstly, but secondly, it
of bringing us to the problem of omniscience. Just
the general problem. Is that the general problem?
Yeah, that right there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to now focus this problem on the problem of omniscience, and then I'm going to talk about what I think is like the best kind of response that ultimately doesn't convince me. And then I'll provide my own model, kind of where I'm at currently. And so, I'm still thinking about this.
Just a quick note, right after you finish kind of outlining the problem with respect to omniscience, I'm gonna make both of us full screen again so they can, I don't even know if the recording is gonna show them our faces while the screen is sharing. So we can at least be certain that they can see our glorious faces, of course.
Well, I hope they can see us even now, but if they can't, that will be a great evil.
Yes, exactly. And that would be atrocious, especially because you're doing the in and out things with your.
I would stop believing in God. That's the kind of evil that there could be no good reason for that.
Exactly. Totally gratuitous.
Okay. So here we have the seed that gives rise. Number one is the seed that gives rise to the packaging problem. So I'm going to just read it again. For any things, whatever they are, call them the X's, there's something that packages them, whether it's a set, a proposition, a thought, or knowledge. Okay, knowledge is going to be the key here. And by the way, sometimes people will ask me about sets. They say, well, don't we have a solution to this problem? Isn't this why we have Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, which in a way provides a restriction on the kinds of things that can be packaged by sets? And, doesn't that solve the problem? And can't we do the same thing with respect to propositions and with respect to knowledge? And we can come back to how we might try to apply a restriction. I think that's an important kind of question. Like, is there a way of applying a restriction? But actually, what I want to say is that what the problem does is it actually tells us that we need some restriction. And the Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory is, in a way, kind of shining the light on this result. It's in a way accepting the conclusion of this argument. It's saying that, yes, like not everything is packaged. The necessary truth at the end, necessarily not everything is packaged, whether by a set or by an item of knowledge. So we do need to have some kind of restriction. And it's also kind of interesting too, when you think about set theory, that Zermelo-Fraenkel's solution has always kind of bothered me. I came up with my own set of axioms because I never really thought that all of their axioms were true, just to be very honest. Like when I try to see it for myself, I'm not just following the authorities and the mathematician. When I was at Notre Dame, I got into these arguments with a math professor who liked set theory. And I said, I'm not against sets. I just don't think the Zermelo-Fraenkel got the first principles right. And part of the problem is it just seems sort of arbitrary. Like why do sets package some things and not other things? It's like if sets are going to package things, they should just package everything. So I kind of sort of like the plural reference view that sets aren't actually packages. They're just ways of referring plurally to things, and that provides kind of a clean solution. There's another idea in Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. There's this thing you can find called positive set theory, which I'm not going to go into that, but I thought that felt a little bit less arbitrary than Zermelo-Fraenkel's theory. But either way, no matter how you respond to this, whether you follow Zermelo and Fraenkel's solution or something else, you're still going to be accepting this result, that there's a necessary truth such that not everything is packaged. So how does this relate to omniscience? Well, I think you can sort of anticipate this here, because knowledge acts as a package. If God knows all things that exist, God knows that Joe and I exist, and God knows that Joe, I, and the audience exists. And so, there's God knows everything that exists. So then for any things, the X's, there's some knowledge of those X's. And that contradicts, obviously, the conclusion of this argument. So what are you going to do? How are you going to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, just for the audience, notice what we just concluded. Not everything is known. Not everything. God doesn't know everything. God couldn't know everything. Yes. I'm just going to reiterate just to reiterate that is significant.
Yes.
God doesn't know everything and cannot know everything. Let that sink in. Okay, because that's significant.
So I have an article. Do you remember the name of my article, Joe? It came out in this book. It's a little chapter. I sent you like a draft. It's on this topic where I describe.
I'm gonna link that in the description. Would you let me link that in the description?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. So everyone, check out the first link in the description under the all caps resources. It's very accessible. It's very accessible, and it's for a general audience. It's for a general audience, and it's about this paradox of omniscience and Josh's solution to it, and how it affects your model of God, which we're going to talk about soon. So anyway, go on.
Well, yeah, and I also share my story there because when I was at Notre Dame, there was just this random day where I was outside, and for whatever reason, I was thinking about infinities. I was thinking about mathematics and numbers, and I was just like thinking about God knowing all of the numbers, and that didn't seem so problematic. But it's like after you know all of the numbers, then there's this other thing that which is your knowledge of all the numbers. And then your knowledge of all the numbers. And that leads to like this other infinite step. And then once that's like completed in some weird way of completing the infinite set, there's like also God's knowledge of his knowledge of that. And it just like, there was something about it that it made my mind go weird. And I don't know, like sometimes I'll kind of send out a thought into the universe, just into the cosmic mind, or, however you want to put this. It's like, I was like, God, do you just see all of that? Like these, and I had this thought back, and this could be, just out of my own psychology, right? There's several ways of interpreting it, but the thought back was, I leave some things open for discovery. And I thought, well, I can't believe that. I don't believe that. I was a Platonist. I thought all the abstract, I mean, even God's mind aside, there are all these abstract things are already there. But then after that episode, that's when I began to discover this propositions paradox. And when I started teaching at APU, I would sometimes bring this up in some of my more advanced classes, and we'd have some discussions, and sometimes I'd talk with other philosophers about it. And a few years back, I gave this talk talking about it, going through some solutions. And it's one of those problems, like sometimes a problem kind of goes away after you think about it, you get some more clarity, it goes away. But other times a problem gets bigger as you think about it. I've been thinking about this with respect to materialism and thinking about reality being fundamentally mindless. It's like sometimes a problem, like once you think about it more carefully, you can sort of resolve the problems. And sometimes they sort of sprout into more and more problems. And that happened with respect to this problem. Like the more that I thought about it, the sharper the problem came, the clearer the contradiction seemed to be. And so in my little article, I kind of say it's like the twin witnesses of revelation and reason began to change my mind about sort of the foundations of math, the foundations of logic, and the foundations of a supreme mind as well. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just going to say, so we've laid out the paradox, right? The paradox, just to the audience, is about packaging, and knowledge is one such kind of package. It's referring to things. And what we conclude is that not everything can be packaged. So not everything can be known by God. God doesn't know everything, and cannot know everything, because such would entail a contradiction. Now that's significant.